From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Well, welcome to the Library of Congress. I'm John Cole. I'm the director of the library's Center for the Book, which is the reading promotion arm of the Library of Congress. We have the wonderful job of promoting books and reading and literacy in libraries, not only here at the Library of Congress, but also around the country. And we do this primarily through a network of state centers for the book that promote books and reading and are very active in developing regional and local book festivals. We also have a program of reading nonprofit and governmental reading promotion partners that in fact met with us this past week to talk about good ideas for promoting books and reading. This particular series, called Books and Beyond, was created a dozen years ago to help us make a simple point, and that is that libraries have collections that often end up in books. And in this case, we of course pay a particular attention to the resources of the Library of Congress. And by and large, the books that we feature, the new books and the authors who are featured, have used the collections of the Library of Congress or are involved with our institution in some kind of special project. That is the case of Abby, who is our speaker today. Abby Sallenger, who I also will point out, told me that he has been on this book tour. He's been to a couple of the regional centers for the book that are connected with our centers for the book, one in Louisiana, another in South Carolina, with Virginia coming up, the Virginia Festival for the Book, and now he's here at the Mother Lode at the Library of Congress. So we're very pleased to have him as part of the event. This series is being actually broadcast, or actually filmed for broadcast later on the Library of Congress's website. And for that reason, we'd like you to turn off all things electronic. There will be a question and answer period towards the end of the program, and we hope that you have questions, but remind you that by asking a question, you're also giving us permission to use your ideas and your image if we so choose on one of our webcasts. But we're pleased that you are here for the presentation. I also would like to point out there are some handouts at the back which have a listing of future talks in this program. There also is some information about how we are now part of Facebook with a Books and Beyond Facebook book club, where you can learn about what's coming up, what we've had on in the series, and exchange your views and ideas, of course, with both the people who've presented and people who are about to present. There's information about Facebook and also about our schedule in the back. We are very pleased to have co-sponsorship with most of these talks with the various custodial divisions of the Library of Congress, which gives us a chance to show off their treasures and their collections, but also to connect with the Library of Congress as a whole. And we take great pride in the range of divisions that have been co-sponsors for these programs, and we have enjoyed learning more about the collections of the Library of Congress through such presentations. And to introduce today's speaker, I'm pleased to present John Hebert, who is the chief of the library's Geography and Map Division and has a special connection with a major state that's part of this presentation. I'll let John explain that. Let's give John a hand.
Thank you, John, and we welcome the guest speaker, Abby Sallenger, and the audience here. I jumped at the opportunity to introduce our guest because I've had a chance to read his book, but also Abby did some work in the Geography and Map Division reading room, looking at some of our maps and at the coastal features. But let me digress. I was born in Houma, Louisiana, and raised there in the 40s and 50s. Houma is the parish seat of Terrebonne Parish, and as you come into Houma from New Orleans on US 90, there's a plaque there, a historical plaque that says Last Island. And it talks about this tragic event that took place in 1856, Isle Derniere. When I grew up, we could go 10 miles below my hometown and go into the swamps and fish. 30 years ago, I went back to this area, and it's no longer a swamp, it's marsh. That means that there's been an intrusion of salt. What had been beautiful oak trees and blackjack vines and snakes and alligators and everything else roaming around was now just this quiet, windy area of brown grass as far as you could see. In the 1950s, I was in scouting, and I was asked by the Soil Conservation Director in Houma to go below to a place where we had just established something called the Houma Navigation Canal. We were going to be big time in progress. This is in the early 50s. And we had built this canal that ran from the Gulf up to the Intracoastal Canal, and we were going to rival New Orleans for all kind of business. What we were concerned about in 56 was the fact that that canal had been built, and all of a sudden we began to notice that the surrounding land was getting lower. And where houses had been, and we could see where farms had actually been cultivated, small little gardens, were now nearly underwater. And so we walked back in there, avoiding the nutria folks. I don't know if you all know what nutria is, but it's a beast that kills muskrats. But anyway, avoiding these little habitats of the nutria, we started planting Australian pine with the idea that this was going to hold the soil. It didn't. So when Abby Sallenger writes about an impact of a storm on one of our great barrier islands in Louisiana, it comes home to me. I feel it. It's an area where I grew up and still have cousins, aunts and uncles, friends from high school, and we see things changing, and see things changing very quickly. Abby Sallenger is the author of this book, Island in a Storm. But what he doesn't tell you is that what he really was working on for a long time with USGS was the Atlas of Shoreline Changes in Louisiana from 1853 to 1989. This is a complete study of the changes in the way in which barrier islands are shaped and formed along the coast. It's an atlas that was produced with U.S. Geological Survey and Louisiana Geological Survey, I think, combined. Abby is an oceanographer with a BA in geology from University of Maine and a PhD from the University of Virginia. And he was the former chief scientist at the U.S. Geological Survey Center for Coastal Geology and presently leads the USGS Storm Impact Research Group. I've spoken too long. It's time for him to speak. Abby Sallenger, Dr. Sallenger.
Thanks very much, John. I very much appreciate the kind words. First of all, I want to say how much I appreciated working here at the Library of Congress. What a marvelous place. I'm based in Florida, but my day job is the U.S. Geological Survey out in Reston, and sometimes we come downtown, of course, for briefings and stuff. And so I would grab an hour after lunch or something and go to the geography and map room downstairs here, numerous evenings over in the reading room across the street, looking at some of the mid-19th century texts on geology, coastal geology, and on oceanography and meteorology, and trying to understand what was known back then to try to instill some realism in my book. My book is about the people who are on this island that John mentioned. It's the small island over all the way to the left, to the west here on that image. That image, by the way, is provided to us from the Library of Congress, and is part of the digital collection here that is just fabulous. I spent hours and hours and hours at home just going through the digital images and stuff. Now, those who know what this should look like, this is John Bachman's work, who went around the country. I don't know all the detailed history of this, but this was 1861, right before the Civil War really got rolling. And he did a number of these, what he called bird's eye views of the coast and harbors and potential military locations along the coastline. And this is part of a larger map that he put together from Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, even part of Florida. And then the New York artists got it and they made it a little more forbidding looking. Actually, it was kind of interesting, surprising what they were able to do with it. One reason I really fell in love with that shot as a depiction of what the book is about is that it really illustrates the complex form of the land. The book is very much about the land. It's about the people who are on this island. There were 400 people. We'll talk about them in a minute. 200 of them died. And there's a reason that the other 200 didn't die. They came very close to doing that. But if you choose to read the book, you'll see that the land is as much of a character as the people themselves. I study the land. My whole career has been about, and my graduate work was about how the land changes, why does it look the way it looks? Particularly, we call it geomorphology or coastal geomorphology. Why does the coast acquire a certain shape? Why does it change so rapidly under certain conditions and not so rapidly under other conditions? And I thoroughly enjoyed that. But the book is also about the future. It's about what a mid-19th century hurricane tells us about what may happen over the next 100 years as our seas rise. It also tells us something, a fascinating lesson that I've got in these talks that John mentioned, where we've gone around to different regional centers for the book to give presentations. It's gotten people's interest, and it certainly has gotten mine, of how different people in the mid-19th century handled a great disaster than we handle them today. Our usual way of thinking is that the way we handle it today is, great advance, we're really on top of it, and those guys back in 1856 didn't quite know which way was up. That's not the case here, and we'll talk about that. Again, the island is there on the left. It's called Last Island, and it is the last of the chain of barrier islands to the west in Louisiana. Here's what it looks like in a more appropriate scale. It's about 24 miles long. This is in 1853, 3 years before the storm. 1840s, 1850s was about the time when maps really became good, useful for geomorphologists, coastal geologists, and oceanographers to take the early maps and compare them to maps of today to see how much our coast has changed. I mean, they really did a remarkable job. The Coast Survey did a remarkable job at that time putting these things together. And the island was about 24 miles long. Looked very much like this. What was interesting about it, I have a friend in Louisiana, a professor at LSU, who took me out there the first time. And John and I were just talking. We drove through Houma, my first time in Houma. And then you go down to the end of the road in central Louisiana in a place called Cocodrie. And then they put you on a boat. And I didn't know it at the time, but I would have really checked the qualifications of the driver if I'd have known what was coming next, because we were twisting and winding through bayous for a couple hours before we emerged on the backside here of Isle Derniere to get there. It's a fabulous place. And then I set foot on this place. And, you know, I've been in the field for a long time. I've seen barrier islands in Alaska, certainly along the east coast of the United States. Grew up, my sister and I grew up on the Outer Banks. Family had a house out there, and we would go back every time. My dad was in the Navy, so that was the only place we really knew was home. And our house there was on this huge dune about 20 meters high. And I walk on this place, and this was about the mid-1980s, and nowhere is it higher than 5 or 6 feet high. Nowhere. You know, I'm going, what is this? This is not what I call a barrier island. And that has huge implications on the vulnerability of that island, not only of the landform itself, but of the people who came to live there. Huge implications. It also has implications to today that we'll talk about. That why is that island so low? Is that happening now and elsewhere? These are the kind of things that we really need to think about. So one thing I want you to think about here for just a second is imagine yourself standing on that beach right there. And imagine the sea rising 5 meters, 5.5 meters, 16, 17 feet. Because that's what happened during the 1856 storm. The storm surge, the wind pushing primarily from the wind pushing the water against the land and raising sea level against the land. And remember, the island's only 5, 6 feet. And we know that from the Coast Survey didn't do topo maps at the time of really low-lying features like this. But they had extensive notes, and so going through, I found those at the Library of Congress, those notes okay, that's almost a quote from the surveyors there, that the place didn't rise up higher than 5 or 6 feet high. So we put 10 feet of water, 3 meters of water, over that island. What does that mean? And that's what happened. The entire island went completely underwater. And this is the way they announced it to the world in 1856. This is a copy of Frank Leslie's Illustrated, dated August 30, 1856. 20 days after landfall. I think that's just remarkable that they print this thing, they distribute it 20 days after landfall. And if you read the book, you know, the people on the mainland didn't even know this storm happened for a week, not weeks, but at least a week after it occurred. But an artist drew this depiction based upon interviewing survivors and stuff. And I found that fascinating. And I read the article for the first time here, as a matter of fact. So that's one thing that we're talking about here, is what happens when you have a real low island that goes completely underwater. The thing to think about is what happened during Hurricane Ike in 2008. Same thing. Not in Galveston, not where all the press hung out or and stuff like that. It was immediately to the north in a place called the Bolivar Peninsula. Just like Isle Derniere, it didn't rise up more than 5 or 6 feet high. There's something like 3,000 homes on Bolivar, and over 2,000 of them, roughly, were completely destroyed. When we went there immediately after that storm, all you would see was a forest of pilings that once held homes up. That's the kind of violence that we're talking about that happened here in 1856. as well. Here's another map, an 1860 map of central Louisiana showing the Isle Derniere, the central part of the map all the way at the bottom. That's Southwest Pass to the right, which is the primary entranceway into the river. The book is also about the mariners who were immediately offshore Isle Derniere during the storm, and it came upon them and caught them by surprise. And again, I want to just emphasize that this is about the land as well as the people, and about a dynamic land. This land of the Mississippi Delta is formed by sediment coming down over thousands of years from Middle America down the Mississippi, and it gets dumped into the Gulf Coast, and it slowly compacts and it sinks. So this is a dynamic land that's not only changing, with storms and erosion of the shoreline, but it's also sinking. And that sinking induces a rise in the sea of about 1 centimeter per year. Pretty much what a lot of people are thinking will happen worldwide over the next 100 years. So this is an interesting place to look at what might be the case along the eastern seaboard or elsewhere in the Gulf Coast in the future. You know, a lot of times when we, particularly scientists, when we start thinking about the future and extrapolating and things like that, we figure that they didn't really know what was going on back in the 1900s. The opening of this book is about a young woman from a small town called Plaquemine, Louisiana, near Baton Rouge, who gets on a steamboat and winds her way through bayous out to the island. And it's what she would have seen. Now, she didn't report this, but it's our knowledge of what the conditions of the Delta would have been, the deteriorating conditions of the Delta. And it was because of the sea coming up relative to the land, the sea level rise. And that was important. And I was fascinated. I came across this depiction of oak trees on a barrier island in Louisiana. It was drawn around 1900. And there's a fabulous writer, Lafcadio Hearn, from New Orleans, who wrote a description of such trees. And he said, "The trees all bend away from the sea. A group of oaks I remember is especially suggestive. 5 stooping silhouettes in line against the horizon, like fleeing women with streaming garments and wind-blown hair, bowing grievously and thrusting out arms desperately northward as to save themselves from falling. And they are being pursued, indeed, for the sea is devouring the land." This was written in 1870. They knew something was going on, that this was a very dynamic environment, that they could see the land change from trip to trip out to the coast. Just like we could when I started working in Louisiana, and we would go, I don't know how many trips over the next decade, started in the mid-'80s. Every time you would go out there, you'd see something different in the bayous. It's just changing. It's a fabulous, interesting place. Let's talk about the people. When I started this, I'm a research scientist, and so we spend our workday writing journal papers, 20 pages long, something like that, and it's very prescribed how you do it, the format of it, and stuff like that. What's the hypothesis? How did you do it? What'd you find? And then you're out, and that's it. What I wanted to do was write a story that included science, but I wanted the science to be paying less, not a textbook. I wanted to write a story where people could could start understanding and feel what might happen during a great storm like this. And that really was the objective. But then once I started looking into the people, the Cajuns, the Creoles, the German immigrants, the Irish, the whole mixture of people in antebellum Louisiana, this is a time of slavery. It became fascinating for me. This is a depiction right here, looking down another map of the Mississippi River in the center, and each one of those things that looks like a pie coming off of it is a plot of land. And there's a name on each one of those plots, and that's the plantation owner. And so this island had become a fabulous resort for the rich people of coastal Louisiana. They came from New Orleans, the merchants from New Orleans. They came from the sugar plantations, and they went out to the coast. Why? Well, it's a wonderful place to be, an interesting place. Another reason is summertime in Louisiana, in the big cities, in the mid-19th century was downright dangerous. It's extraordinarily dirty. We talked about dead dogs and everything just lying in the streets, and things like epidemics like yellow fever would take over. 3 years before this storm, there was a yellow fever epidemic in New Orleans in 1853 that killed something like 8,000 people. If you had funds, you would leave. If you had the resources, you would leave. And one of the places they started to go was Isle Derniere. This is what it looked like. This is the west end of blow up of Isle Derniere. The village of Isle Derniere is called. We can focus in here on just one part of it. That's the sound or the bay to the north here, to the upper part. And you could see a label here for a hotel. And along this thin barrier island, it's not unlike our barrier island developments today. There's just houses, beautiful homes, 2-3 stories in places, wraparound balconies, all support structures behind stables and stuff like that, a hotel, as it says, right there. We're built right here. And then the storm came. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what happened to the people. There's a young woman I mentioned, Creole. I use Creole in the definition of just French blood. Her father was born in France, and she came here, and her house was destroyed during the storm. She had 6 siblings. Her parents were there, and everyone died except for her. One of the phenomenal things, you know what, I tried to take opportunities to get a feel for physically what a storm like that would be like if you or I were there instead of this young woman. And so we talked about how big the waves were. And she's in her house on this beach. House gets knocked down. She gets thrust out into the water. At this time, and the book goes into this in some detail, the wind was blowing offshore. It was before landfall. The wind was blowing offshore. The water came from the back bay, actually across the island, flowing into the Gulf. It swept her into the surf. This giant surf coming in. These people were not totally unaware that things like this had happened before. I found it fascinating that, you know, one of the people on the island talked about great trees that they found. It was a wonderful thing that they found these trees laying on the island, on the top of the island. And it wasn't until after the storm that they started talking about how they got to the top of the island. I mean, that was a previous storm. But Emma, this young girl, was swept offshore, and she grabbed onto debris. And when she was in 3-4 feet of water, she was being pummeled by 3 or 4 foot high waves. But when she reached, she kept moving farther and farther offshore through the surf. And when she was in 6 feet of water, she would have been hit by 6-foot waves. When she was in 12 foot of water, 12-foot waves. It's just the way waves break in the surf, that they're controlled by the depth. The largest waves will be roughly what the water depth is. Yet this young woman, 18 years old, unmarried, and this was a time when young women usually married at 14 or 15, and drove her offshore. She spent 18 hours offshore hanging on to the debris. And then the hurricane came by, and the wind did 180 degrees, and phenomenally blew her right back to the beach over many hours. And she had to make the transit through the surf again, and somehow held on to it. A slave of her father's found her and picked her up and took her to an area where survivors had gathered. The only reason that there were survivors is there was this steamboat that made a dramatic attempt to get to the island to save the people, but it wrecked on the bay side of the island. The wind tore all the superstructure off of it, and the only thing that was left was the hull. And 200 people clambered into that hull, and they survived. Those people survived. Another person, this story, I'll just read you a very short piece from the book. It's got more questions from me, to me, than any others. And it's about how people respond to great tragedy like this, to real super amazing stress. How that young woman did what she did, and how this much older man, he was around in his 40s, he was 6 foot tall. At that time, that was like being 6'5" or something. And he had 7 children and a wife, and in a house there. And they all died. He was the only one who survived. And so this will just take about 2 minutes. Michael Slaughter expected to die. He lay on a mattress on the floor of his home. There was no roof over him. There were no walls around him. He could not move his right side. With the wind now coming from the sea, he asked his wife if the Gulf was washing across the island. Lodoiska answered that it was beginning to cover the sand. His wife clustered near. Some of the children were in tears. Lodoiska stared out at the surf as if waiting for the waves to engulf them. An intact roof floated by and knocked her to the ground. It was the last Michael saw of her. The Gulf then went after the rest of his family. The water floated the wooden floor, with everyone sitting or lying on it, and propelled it toward the bay. Then the huge raft lodged behind a cistern. The waters, now maddened by resistance, came rushing over the floor, wrote Slaughter. Everyone and everything was swept into the surging Gulf. Slaughter's little girl screamed and leapt onto her father, wrapping her arms tight about his neck. Together they flailed in the soup of waves and foam and wreckage. I now rolled over and over, recalled Slaughter, drinking in the hated fluid by great mouthfuls. The dear child still fastened to me when I thought, for reader, I could still think that I must be near gone. Slaughter justified what happened next on his dire circumstances. He expressed sorrow for the consequences of his action, but accepted no responsibility for it and admitted no shame. I put my hands on those of my child and broke her hold of me. God only knows what became of the dear one. Being relieved, I now rose to the surface. He lived, and he It turns out that he ended up back in the marsh, 10 miles inland, and an amazing story of survival back there. But he lived another 30 or 40 years. But the question that's coming up is how can people respond, and how differently they do respond. And we sat with a couple of book groups talking about how could a father throw off his child and stuff like that. And interesting time. The book is also, though, as much about the physical processing and what happened after the storm. This is what the island looked in 1853. This is what that same island looked in 1978. About 3/4 of the surface area had gone away. The Gulf shore had retreated landward about 2/3 of a mile. This is what it looks like together. That storm was so extreme, and we could make another analogy to Katrina. Katrina had similar kinds of impacts to other barrier islands just a few years ago. But in this case, it really triggered some major changes to the island that kept on for over 150 years afterwards. And this is being driven by a succession or a long-term sea level rise with multiple storms coming in and cutting new inlets and driving the island landward. But the last thing I want to talk about is what the people on that island, what they were thinking in the aftermath. It turns out, amazingly, you kind of see this thing in a movie, but I've looked at 3 different references and they all say it the same way. This is an original drawing, architect's depiction, if you will, of it would have been the largest beachfront hotel resort in the country at the time. And they were in New Orleans, the investors were in New Orleans, talking about, putting the final money pot together to make this happen. And this is what it looked like, a phenomenal place. But the people on the island and the investors, the people on the island decided not to rebuild. This place, they said, was hazardous. We're talking 1856. This place is a cool place to come and fish or something like that, but it's not the best place to build your house. The investors went out there and heard the stories and saw what happened. And this now just, the only thing that ever happened with this Grand Hotel is it sits as a beautiful, it's a huge, huge thing. These pictures were actually taken by a friend of both John and mine at the Historic New Orleans Collection, a museum in New Orleans, on a citizen there's a wall there in New Orleans. But it was never built. So the question, I'm not one, you will hear people in my field say, we should not build on coasts. And I would revise that to some degree. I grew up on, like I mentioned, in the Outer Banks, but our house was up 20 meters. It was quite high. That house will be there, I think for at least a couple of hundred more years. Not the house, but the dune will be. And you can quote me on that a couple of hundred years from now. But I think that's important. What's even more important, though, and a little scary, is that places like I was telling you about the Bolivar Peninsula that was virtually wiped out during Hurricane Ike, those places are being rebuilt. And I'm talking primarily, New Orleans is we can talk about it in the question and answers if you want, is a very special case. But the barrier islands along around our country, there are some extraordinarily low areas that are being rebuilt. There's one called Dauphin Island, Alabama, the west end of Dauphin Island. It's been wiped out 4 times since Hurricane Frederick in 1979, 4 times, and rebuilt every single time. So there's a limit here. And I think the message from the people on Isle Derniere is we have to be as sensible as they were, if you will, 150 years ago, in how we treat and how we develop our coastlines. Thank you very much for coming and listening. I sure appreciate it. Any questions? Any questions? Yes, ma'am.
I thought I understood you to say that in 1870, someone took a picture or something of it and noticed or made observations about changes that occurred
Right.
in that whole area from 1853 when this storm occurred.
Right.
So what was the human presence? What's fascinating me is that there's been some discussion with environmentalists about the human impact on areas and accelerating the deterioration of or accelerating forces in nature.
Sure.
But were human beings in these bayous or this area that had changed so in like 20 years back in the 19th century?
Okay. The question is, I think, really, what is the human involvement in causing the changes along the coastline here? Is that fair?
Back then, yes.
Back then, and
Was it a human factor in it?
the human factor. The interesting thing, and it's not discussed enough or as broadly as should be today. When people talk about erosion in Louisiana, it's all attributed to human involvement. But there's a huge natural set of changes that are going on as well. And what's happened today is that the human thing has really exacerbated terribly the natural changes. But back in the mid-1800s, they had started building levees. They had started limiting the amount of sediment that was naturally flooded onto the marshes, for instance. So that was well underway, starting with human habitation, actually, or European habitation in that part of the world in the 1700s. By the early 1800s, it was really getting going. But a lot of what I talk about in my book is the natural evolution of a delta coast. And that includes both destruction of land and creation of new land. And if humans don't get involved so much, like they have today, then they will commonly balance out. But they'll move around. The land will move around. What's happened today is we've limited any building of new land, and everything's just deteriorating. And so it's become a horrible problem. But the direct answer to your question is most of the changes, most of them, my feeling, in the mid-1800s, that was natural, a lot of it. Yeah. Not completely. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
So did you just say that if we leave the land alone, that land that has been destroyed will recover? Or are you aware of methods that we could use to fix that long term?
When the largest problem, in my opinion, okay, the question is, if we left the Mississippi Delta region alone, would it recover? And are there any good techniques to fix it, so to speak? I was on a National Research Council committee overseeing the Corps' management or protection plan for New Orleans and South Louisiana, and sat through a number of discussions along the lines of what you were talking about. And one thing I think is clear, and certainly is clear with the committee, is that there's no way that you can go in today and save all of the land. And unfortunately, you hear, and there's a reason for that, and that's human modification of processes. Not only in Louisiana, but the dams on the rivers far inland have trapped sediment that once migrated all the way down to the Mississippi Delta and don't make it anymore. And so that's confined. So there's not enough sediment there to spew out and to rebuild everything back the way it was. I think what is realistic is to set priorities, and that's very hard to do when priorities in this case is saying these communities will survive and these won't, or these communities will be protected and these other ones will not. But I don't know any other way other than to pick the highest priority areas and do the best you can with them there. Yes, sir.
You mentioned that New Orleans is a special case.
Right.
Could you elaborate on that also, on the question of what we can do now after Katrina?
In New Orleans. The question is I mentioned that New Orleans is a special case, that I'm speaking primarily about barrier islands and how barrier islands change. And New Orleans is a special case because it's below sea level. It's in a very difficult location on the river where it has threats from both the river and from the sea and from a lake just to the north. It's a very rough place to try to protect. The barrier island situation is extraordinarily difficult as well, but really for different kinds of reasons. It's not below sea level, for instance. To me, in New Orleans, choices have to be made as well, and about what can be saved realistically and what cannot. And this becomes an extraordinarily, it quickly goes out of the technical, engineering, geological realm into another realm and political and becomes very, very difficult. Any more questions? Yes, ma'am.
Are our areas now currently mapped along these lines?
You know, the U.S. Geological Survey actually, with our partners in the Corps of Engineers and with NOAA, and NASA have mapped using new technology, airborne lasers called LIDAR, which is a very accurate, relatively accurate mapping technology from aircraft, have mapped the coastlines of mainland United States and compared the data to older data. And we are embarking upon updating this periodically in the future so we can keep better track of what's happening along our coastlines. Yes. Yes, ma'am.
Are you familiar with the Sea Islands off of South Carolina?
To some degree.
Comparable to this island?
Well, you know, there are the questions of the Sea Islands of Georgia and South Carolina comparable to Isle Derniere. There are similarities between barrier islands everywhere, and those are barrier islands. There's places called Sullivan's Island, for instance, Isle of Palms, and in South Carolina, the whole Outer Banks in North Carolina. The where these islands are similar is in terms of how they might respond to a rapid sea level rise. All of them will suffer to some degree by that. There are islands, though, that have greater supply of sediment, sands, that helps maintain, helps replenish naturally sand that's lost during great storms, for instance, and that's important. And so the sea islands, there would be more sand there than there is on the last island or Isle Derniere, and that's a plus in terms of what's happening there. You know, just one way to look at it would be you would expect the Isle Derniere to disappear, and that's ultimately the fate of a barrier island. Under rapid sea level rise, low sand supply, is disappearance. It's happened before in Louisiana and will continue to happen. What I expect, should the scenarios for sea level rise materialize in the future along the east coast of the United States, we will also experience disappearance. But it could be 100 years, could be 200 years. And it won't happen all at once. It will be the most sand deficient barrier islands that are impacted first. Yes, ma'am.
Is there any evidence that Native Americans inhabited that island at some point before the Europeans came here?
You know, I wrote a section about Native Americans, and I looked quite a bit to try to get into that history. John, are you aware?
Yeah, the only Native Americans I know about in that region came down when the Europeans came in. So what we refer to as the Bumas Indians are really coming off the river and are being pushed down into the area. So I don't have any reference to earlier ones. If you go a little bit west of there are Native Americans near Franklin, Louisiana.
Right.
And that's the Chitimacha Indians who were there at the time Europeans arrived. They're not coastal. They're in, I think they're small enough to know that there's also a problem with being too close to the coast.
Yeah.
Well, that might have been a sign indicating to people. I mean, that's really what I'm getting at. If nobody was on it, I wonder.
I found a great quote. There's there was a congregation of Indian culture around Plaquemine, and they made a big deal about, well, you know, we couldn't build right next to the river. I mean, that would be crazy. So they built back, and they had these mounds, and they made elevation, and so I see what you're saying, John.
We have time for one quick question, and then we go to
Yes,
the book
sir.
signing.
Do you
Yeah.
see areas further inland, like Vermilion Parish, Mouton Cove? Do you see those places at some point in your, the future becoming like this island?
Well, that's interesting. You would need, this island comes about from the Mississippi actually coming and building a delta lobe, what geologists would call a delta. It just builds out a lobe of sediment into the Gulf of Mexico. And then, under natural conditions, the Mississippi just kind of flails around to another spot over time scales of hundreds to thousands of years, and like a fire hose that's unconstrained. And once the Mississippi leaves that lobe, the lobe starts to erode, and the natural result is an island like that. Whether that's going to progress well inland or not, I hope not. But it's so flat that it can progress inland quite a ways. Thank you.
Thank you, Abby.
Okay, John.
Let's give Abby a hand. Right. Well, I'd like to certainly thank Abby Sallenger for sharing not only his knowledge, but focusing in on a problem that we're all aware of, and I think all of us who are not specialists in this area have learned a lot. We are going to have a book signing in the back. We're going to move, this table will magically appear near that chair opposite where we're selling the books, and the books are on sale for the Library of Congress discount. And we're very pleased you were here. I'd also like to thank the Geography and Map Division and John Hebert. It was fun to catch the Louisiana flavor of this conversation and to realize, in fact, how universal this problem really is. Let's give them both a round of applause and join us for the book signing.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.